What does Putin want? I think Putin, a couple of things. I think Putin is thinking sort of, Americans are kind of totally unfamiliar with something called international law, which existed before something else we call international law. There's something else we call international law are like the bylaws of the 20th century American empire. The previous system of international law, which I usually call classical international law, if you want to learn about it, you can read, there's this motherfucker named Emmerich de Vattel, which sounds kind of like a rapper, but he was a Swiss diplomat, and he wrote a book simply called The Law of Nations, which is about the law of nations. And if you want, this was the sort of textbook in statesmanship that was used by our founders. It was standard in Europe. It's very, very brief and simple and condenses a lot of previous work. If you want to understand classical international law and you don't have time to listen to my sorry ass, go and read Vattel. That said, basically, that is sort of the world that sort of conditions what Putin is operating under, but it's sort of operating more from a memory of this. The basic principle of Vattel is that it's a multipolar order, and every nation is sovereign. Sovereigns are have to interact under solely a system of natural law, like men marooned on a desert island. Like some of them are strong, some of them are weak. What is the right, the question that many 18th century philosophers were, and previous, really, the law of nations goes back. The classical law of nations is very early because Europe is a very multipolar place very early. What is the sort of the natural rules that pertain between them without having to come together and make up rules? That's sort of what is meant by natural law. So basically, is it the natural law that I can't just fucking kill you? Yeah, probably. And indeed, you're going to find that in basically all except the most perverse legal systems. So when you're basically looking at the natural law of nations, what you're seeing is what is the sort of law that pertains between these sovereigns. And these sovereigns basically have an unlimited right to judge every question for themselves. And they, nothing binds them. In the old multipolar order, there's no power above them that binds them to obey. Sort of almost a confusion of the word law. There is no such thing as international law, right, as positive international law, really, in the Vattellian sense, right? So essentially, the way that war is seen in classical international law is like a sort of armed lawsuit. So when you have a war under classical international law, it's basically saying it's like a tort. It's like a lawsuit. It's like you fucked me, and basically the only way that I can respond is to claim my rights by force. So when Frederick the Great invades Silesia, basically, he invades Silesia because he wants fucking Silesia. But he comes up with this sort of explanation and why under certain ducal inheritance, there's this huge medieval book of because this duke fucked this other duke, it belongs to him, and it doesn't belong to Marie Theresa because she's a woman, and blah blah blah, right? So he comes up with this explanation of why it is justified for him to invade Silesia. In fact, of course, he wants its rich iron and coal mines and shit, and he's like, I can just take this shit from Marie Theresa, right? It turns out to be a little harder than he thinks, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But, that's I'm prosecuting a lawsuit, but there's no sort of court which I can prosecute the lawsuit before and that will enforce the judgment. I have to enforce the motherfucking judgment myself on this bitch Marie Theresa, right? And that's sort of so it's sort of a lawsuit, a kind of a system in which the lawsuit is sort of a combat of arms. And in this combat of arms, the richest and strongest tend to win, which is exactly the way it works in a fucking court, except it would make much better TV. Right? Basically, for example, in this lawsuit, Louis, in this sort of concept, Louis XIV, very, very influential, absolute monarch. They called him the Sun King. Right. He reigned for 50 years, incredible badass. I mean, there's, and his cannon are emblazoned with the Latin phrase "ultima ratio regum," which means the last argument of kings. So basically, in terms of the lawsuit here, like how is the West behaving in a way that is sort of illegitimate and justifies basically suing? Why is Putin ready to sue the Ukraine, or sometimes I just say Kiev regime? The grounds of this lawsuit are, number one, the detachment of the Ukraine from the Soviet Union, including, one of the three old and great Russian cities, Kiev, Petersburg, Moscow, was basically this sort of act of quasi banditry in the fall of the Soviet Union.